Thomas Frank is the author of a number of books, including What's the Matter with Kansas and Listen Liberal. He is also a columnist for The Guardian, and he joins us now. First of all, Tom, thanks for coming back on the program.
You got it, Richard, anytime.
Well, I appreciate that. And let's talk. You've written a couple things lately about Russia. And by lately, I mean, let's say in the last 2, 3 months. And the Russia story is one where I feel so many people I talk to, they're great people, they're sane people, they're rational people, and then Russia comes up, and I feel like I've slipped into a funhouse world. As I mentioned earlier, are we experiencing, and by we in this sense, I guess the broader democratic or progressive community, a case of sort of collective delusion here? Or what exactly is going on with all the buzz about Russia?
Well, look, so what I wrote about were these ads on Facebook, okay? And as far as I can tell, this really happened. This is not, some kind of fake news or something like that. Some people operating, some Russian trolls, paid trolls operating out of a building in St. Petersburg really, for sure, made these ads on Facebook. And I wrote about it. So you don't know this, Richard, but, well, maybe you do. Years ago, I used to write about advertising. That was a subject I was very interested in. And what you find in the history of ads, and so there's a million ways to think about these ads and talk about these ads, but one of the things that has always intrigued me about advertising is that there have been a series of moral panics about advertising over the years, right? You remember Vance Packard?
Sure, the hidden persuaders.
Persuaders, yeah. Yes. And subliminal ads, all this sort of thing. There's been a whole series of these, and this is another one. And so, on the one hand, this definitely happened, right? These ads exist. In a column I wrote for The Guardian, I talk about them in detail, and I find them very amusing. But I think it's a mistake to attribute to this social media campaign the kind of significance that people are attributing to it. People think it single-handedly swayed the election. People think that it was fantastically effective. People think that it was really, really sophisticated. None of those things are true. But it did happen, and it is amusing, and it is, something worth studying.
Well, yes, certainly here's what I know. Let's say if we talk about Facebook ads, I know that they were, first of all, I have to say, yes, they really happened. But I've also seen hype. For example, Robbie Mook, who is Hillary Clinton's campaign manager, wrote a piece blaming pretty much his failures on everybody else. And one of the things,
I haven't seen this. I got to read this one.
well, it's a long time ago, but I'll send it to you if you want. But one of the links in it said words to the effect of the Russian government. We know that the Russian government undermined Hillary Clinton's campaign with social media ads, and there was a link, and I may have been the only reader to click on the link, but the link went to an article about Macedonian teenagers who were creating fake news websites for money. So the link that he attributed to the Russian government, apparently he is unaware that Macedonia is a different country and that these were not government representatives. So even
by the way, and that we still don't know what their connections are to the Russian government. That hasn't been established by anyone.
Right.
Anyone that I've read, So the Facebook, when this first was revealed last year, there was a Senate investigation of this, and Facebook came out, came clean and announced how much. I mean, there's ways of measuring advertising. And one of the ways we measure it is how much it costs to place the ad. Okay, since we obviously don't know what the budget of this Russian troll farm, we have no idea what the actual budget was, how many people they employ, any of that. We don't know those things, but we do know how much they gave Facebook for the ads. Do you know what it was, Richard?
It was like $100-something
It was
thousand.
$100,000. Yeah, around $100,000. And if you look at the total amount spent in, of course, 2016, the most expensive political campaign of all time, as they always are every 4 years, it's a little bit more expensive. It was something like $9 billion. So, compared to what Robbie Mook was throwing around, and
Right.
and by the way, everybody had a troll farm in this election. I didn't have one, but I kind of wish I had. By the way, I was just reading a story from early in 2017 about the most successful tweeter, I guess you would say, guy on Twitter in the course of the 2016 election. And it was a retired guy in Chicago who had set up a kind of device on his computer that would, tweet things mechanically all day long. It would just go on and on and on and on. And he was very successful. His tweets got retweeted. And the detail that I really love from this story is that before Twitter got invented, this is a guy that wrote a lot of letters to the editor. Okay.
He was that guy. There's that one guy.
Exactly. Yeah. And now which is all very, well and good. It's very amusing. That's the world we're living in. But to blame guys like that for the failure of a campaign like Hillary Clinton's, which had every advantage you can name, they had the big data, they had the algorithms, they had the micro-targeting, they had the money. She outspent Trump 2-1,
Right.
She was running TV commercials wall to wall to then say, well, these guys who spent $100,000 on Facebook are what did us in.
Of course. People say, well, they were seen by X millions of people. Well, how many people see how many Facebook things flash by? But I have to say, just parenthetically, because you talked about the moral panic in advertising, which goes, of course, all the way back to scantily clad flappers in advertising Sen candy or New Grape soda, in the 1920s or whatever. But your favorite of these ads was also my favorite. And so I have to just take a moment to honor it, which is the one that shows Satan and Jesus arm wrestling. And Satan is saying,
beautiful.
If I win, Clinton wins. And Jesus is saying, not if I can help it. And by the way, if you look closely, Tom, you didn't mention this in your writing. It's not actually Jesus. It's 1970s era Cat Stevens, I think.
Oh, is that right?
Well, he looks like him. The hair is darker, the beard's darker. I expect him to sing I'm being followed by a moon shadow at any moment. And then it says, press like to help Jesus win.
I love it because it's both. This is what I love about it. It's both extremely pious and blasphemous at the same time, right?
Right.
The idea that Jesus needs your help to win anything, that God needs you have to click something so that so that the kingdom of the Lord can be established here. It's absolutely nuts. And the idea that, we aren't going to get into, which candidate was a better Christian.
Right. Let's not go there. But, and by the way, as you say, and here's another thing I want to talk about there. As you say, to make things clear, and I'm quoting you, the caption tells us that, quote, Hillary, I'm sorry, I can't do this with a straight face. The captain tells us that Hillary is a Satan. Now,
it's not even, it's the English is so, these things are written by people who don't really speak English.
No, that's the point. That is one of the points here, is that it's so clearly not written by an English speaker. By the way, Satan is capitalized, indicating that it's being used as a proper name. Ergo identifies an individual.
There's only one Satan.
But she is a Satan. It's like, so somehow we are to believe that this.
But by the way, there's hundreds of these. There's hundreds and hundreds of these, and you can find them on the internet if you dig. And they are hilarious. They're so stupid. You should dig them up and see. They will make you laugh. And so when I first wrote about them back in December of last year, I said, first of all, it's weird because all this has come out, and yet our liberal newspaper columnists haven't grabbed it and run with it. And I thought, that's strange. I wonder why not, What about these? Because to me, this is a gold mine. Not because you can then blame the election outcome on these ads, but because they do a very interesting thing. All of a sudden, the Russians are these Russian in the Russian troll farm in St. Petersburg are mouthing the sort of traditional slogans of the American right wing, and that's kind of gold in and of itself, whether it had anything to do with the election, because Richard, for my entire life, being on the left meant that you got taunted for being a dupe of the Russians. Do you
Right.
remember
No.
this? All our lives this happened, and so here's these ads where basically Russians in this Russian troll farm are trying to imitate the American right. So as far as I'm concerned, from now on, whenever somebody says support your local sheriff, you can say, what are you, some kind of Russian stooge?
Well, but it's
And I was like, why aren't we saying this? Why isn't this happening? So here's the answer. I mean, if you want to let me go on, and I can shut up.
yes. Go on. No, no, go
So
on.
I was trying to understand why aren't columnists talking about this everywhere? Why aren't they just like this is a gold mine of can I curse?
No, no, but you can think it. You can still think it.
It's a gold mine of BS. Why aren't we just like hitting this with everything we got? And the answer is because it also reflects real poorly on Facebook. And I don't know if you remember this, but the Democratic Party, until very recently, was closely identified with Facebook, with Twitter, with Google, with the promise of social media in general. Remember how Obama would do those conferences with Zuckerberg? They were
Right.
such great pals. I mean, all these people from Google came into the Obama White House, were basically, running it by the end of his administration. They were much closer to the administration was much closer to Google by the end than it was to Goldman Sachs, in the beginning when they were bailing out the banks. And so there's this reluctance on the part of liberals to look at these companies and say, hey, Facebook isn't as liberating as we've been saying all along. So that was my answer to it. But then along comes the Mueller investigation, and it indicts these people in the Russian troll farm, and we go from not talking about it at all to talking about nothing else in a very short period of time.
Well, I mentioned that for some people, it's an entirely exculpatory narrative that you can say. One of the reasons I think why Democrats and liberals haven't picked up on this story and run with it is that many of them, particularly those in positions of influence, those who kind of like the political party structure being what it is, pundits, including perhaps Paul Krugman, who he wrote about in a different context recently, but many others. To many people, it's kind of like, oh, okay, we didn't make a mistake backing the Obama-Clinton corporate-friendly ideology. We didn't make a mistake insisting that Hillary Clinton be the nominee because she was more electable than anyone else the human intellect could imagine. We didn't make any kind of mistake at all. It was really the Russians who threw this thing for us. But I do want to get back to the issue of demonizing the left and all of this. But don't you think there's something to that this was basically a narrative that people could latch onto, so that they didn't have to look at maybe some errors in judgment they might have made themselves along the way?
Oh, of course, Richard. But that's exactly what's going on now. So instead of, I thought that liberals should talk about these ads as for the same reason that I was just telling you about them, because they're amusing, because they make conservatives look it calls the whole sort of conservative sloganeering project into question. But that's not what they're interested in doing. They're interested in getting themselves off the hook for losing the 2016 election to a guy that they really should have beaten. And that's a fairly bogus project, if you ask me. I mean, this is one lame excuse, but that's why you're exactly right. That's why they've latched onto it now, and that's why they're talking about it now. And they exaggerate its sophistication. So earlier we were talking about how clumsy and amateurish and cheap, bargain basement cheap this campaign was. and now they've sort of laden it with all sorts of significance and attributed to it all kinds of sophistication, which is just flatly false. So in my most recent story for The Guardian, I quote at some length from a Washington Post story where they're interviewing a high-ranking member of the Clinton campaign, and he thinks it's a marker of sophistication that these Russian trolls knew that Donald Trump was reaching out to Bernie Sanders voters, and I couldn't believe it when I read that. I was like,
Well,
everybody knew that. Trump said it.
and you, of
You know,
course he did. He said Bernie voters.
that's how every political campaign runs.
Right.
Of course, that's what you do. And it's like, that's not sophistication. That's just like opening up the newspaper and reading it. And then the Post goes on, and they think it's a mark of sophistication that the Russian trolls knew that there are such things as battleground states.
Right.
Now, this doesn't make any sense. We have to, I mean, everyone knows that. If you know anything about American politics, you know that. Now, so we have to pretend that that's something that's like really, beyond us and difficult to understand. We have to do all these, silly things, make ourselves seem really stupid to ourselves in order to get the Hillary Clinton campaign off the hook. This is crazy.
And again, we're talking with author Thomas Frank about the ramifications of the Russia story. And Tom, in your most recent piece for The Guardian, you got the money quote, my friend, from the Washington Post interview, or at least quoting Brian Fallon, former Hillary Clinton press secretary, who refers to the efforts that we've just been chuckling over a bit. Quote, "It seems like the creative instincts and the sophistication exceeds a lot of the U.S. political operatives who do this for a living." You can't make this stuff up.
Because they knew there were swing states.
Right. And they knew
creativity.
Right. But I want to go back to this thing about the left. You mentioned that there was a time when the left was constantly being accused of being puppets of Russia, of the Soviet Union. I myself, while in junior high school, was addressed as Eskow from Moscow, reflecting, I would say, a level of sophistication equal to that of the Russian trolls on Facebook.
Wait, right there. I'm going to get you something. I'm going to show you an example of this right here in my office, Richard.
All right, let's switch. Let's see what Tom's getting there. Right now, we just see his.
Okay,
shelf.
so do you remember Jack Abramoff?
Of course, I've interviewed
when he was head of the college Republicans. When he was head of the college Republicans, this was one of the posters that he put out. The Soviet Union needs you. And you see what it is?
Support a U.S. nuclear freeze.
If you support the nuclear freeze,
yeah, then you are working for
you're a commie stooge.
Right. Well, I was Eskow from Moscow.
That's in the 1980s. I was in college then.
Yeah. Well, look, that's what we're up against. But here's
but now it's flipped. You see, now it's completely the other way around.
But look
at some of these Russian Facebook ads. It's like every right-wing meme you can imagine, and that's what the Russians are supporting.
I might. Okay, in a sense, I would state it a little differently, and maybe we can disagree here a little bit, but I think that's what it should be, because the vast majority of Russian messages were right-wing. Therefore, you'd think that non-right-wing folks could have a little bit of fun saying, you're Russia's stooge or whatever. But here's what I think has actually happened. What I suspect has happened is that once again, the left is the target. Even though Vladimir Putin, in no one's estimation, is a left-winger, even though the very little of this propaganda, or whatever you want to call it, Russia-based and Macedonia-based and otherwise, Chicago-based, is directed against a little bit toward the left. But it's all the efforts that we've seen, whether it's Facebook trying to filter ads, or Twitter trying to filter, or Google searches. You hear about alternets, results and traffic are way down, Counterpunch. I mean, it's all the left outlets that are getting the loss in traffic, and it's the left. My Twitter feed is filled with people saying that, Bernie's a Russian agent, Bernie supporters are Russian agents, and this is from Democrats, this is from liberals who I think it's being used to conduct a leftist purge.
Well, Richard, I don't want to. I think that you are right in a broad sense, but I don't think this is deliberate by anyone. But I'll just tell you from my own experience. We're in a really funny place here in America now, where I'm reading I've always, all my life, I have attacked and mocked and fought against the idea of liberal media bias. Going back to the 70s, published essays about it. Worked on this subject. But something is going on now in the American media, and the range of acceptable opinions is being defined down and down and down, more and more narrow. And what's happening is that people with views like mine, and I don't even write about foreign policy. I don't really write about controversial stuff. I write about, labor and Social Security and, the American domestic politics and that kind of thing. I think my views have become unacceptable in America. I used to be in mainstream media outlets all the time, on TV, and now I'm not. And I think I'm as reasonable as ever, Richard. I don't know. Maybe you can correct me on this, but we are living in a really peculiar time, and I don't really have an explanation for why things are going this way, except for that there has never been a time where it's been more obvious to me that the Democratic Party has to move to the left on economic issues. And yet the Democratic Party doesn't want to do that. And they will, in fact, invent any kind of sophistry or hollow, set of logic, or come up with any kind of scapegoat to avoid doing that. And by the way, this gets us to that the other column that I wrote recently about Paul Krugman, that for years it was gospel among a certain kind of mainstream media figure that, in fact, there was no problem for the Democratic Party with working class white people, that they were not leaving the Democratic Party, that this was all a myth. It was not happening, and then look what happens to Hillary Clinton. And so, this is obviously a subject I've been writing about for many, many years, the sort of hemorrhaging of working class votes by the Democratic Party. So then with Hillary in 2016, it becomes undeniable. So the obvious answer then is, well, what do you do? What does the Democratic Party do to win back the votes of working class people? We all know what the answer to that is. You swing to the left on the issues that matter to them, namely, things like healthcare, cost of education, pay, inequality, all of these economic issues. But Richard, they don't want to do that.
Right.
And so they will come up with any explanation or any excuse or any way of denying the scenario that I just outlined for you, so that they don't do, so that they're not required to, so that it's not obvious that they have to do this. They will do anything to avoid it.
Yeah.
And they will, and this seems like folly, right? Because they're a political party. You'd think they'd want to win. That would make sense to me, right? That's what political parties do. They win elections and they wield power. But I think that is secondary for the people that we're talking about. Because if you really wanted to win, you would get those voters back. You would go out and do what obviously has to be done in order to get those voters back. They're not doing those things. Instead, they are counting on Trump to be so incompetent and to be so corrupt that he bungles, everything. And this has worked for them in the past. Republicans have been so awful. Think of George W. Bush, that you can't help but, the Democratic Party makes a comeback. They don't have to do anything differently. But that's their strategy. And no. I don't think this is a wise, I'm sorry, I should shut up. I know. I don't think this is a wise strategy for the long term.
Well, obviously, you're talking to somebody who agrees with you a lot on that, but I think that it depends. Unfortunately, I think that a lot of the people involved, there are multiple factors here, and I'm sure we agree on what most of them are. I mean, one of them in some cases is self-interest, that if the party radically shifts philosophy and approach, it may want different advisors, different consultants, different staffers, and so I think some people have self-interest, but we know also how self-interest works. It colors your perceptions, so a lot of people aren't so crass as to say, I'm putting my self-interest above party and country. They just manage to reframe their view of the world so that it looks that way. And I think in other cases it's anthropology, right? I mean, I've written a lot and thought a lot about Krugman because I was the writer on the Bernie Sanders campaign, and when he started going after Bernie and anyone who spoke in Bernie's defense, I mean, I really felt I was seeing an anthropological phenomenon at play, that someone had committed taboo, had said,
That's
had
good.
uttered taboo speech and advocated taboo deeds, and that unself-consciously they needed to be expelled and punished. That's what I thought was really going
Richard,
on.
have you seen my story about the Washington Post and their op-ed page, their editorial page, war on Bernie Sanders? Because it's very similar.
Uh-huh.
They would attack him from any direction. It didn't matter, left, right, whatever. Make things up, have things that are real. Doesn't matter. It's just like he was anathema, and it had to be. And the way they would explain it, when they would get around to explaining it, didn't hold water at all. They would say you can't propose ideas that don't have a very good chance of being enacted. But we all know that happens in politics all the time.
Right.
That's a ridiculous explanation. I mean, think gun control, right? It's happened.
Right.
We by that logic, we should never talk about it because we have the Second Amendment, and that's absurd. Of course, we're going to talk about it. It's an important issue, but I agree with you. But I think it's more, instead of anthropology, I would say sociology. That Sanders represented, the Democratic Party is, as I've said many times, is a party that's identified, it's singularly identified with a social class. The class is, white collar professional class. That's who controls the party. That's who's in charge. That's, who is its most loyal, or some of its most loyal voters. That's who donates, on and on and on. That's its, constituents. And the party identifies with this group. And they look at someone like Bernie Sanders, and he represents who the Democrats used to be, with his New Deal way of talking, his New Deal proposals. I mean, to me, I find him, and by the way, a lot of people that I talk to, older people and even Republicans, liked him and found him reassuring because he reminded them of the sort of Truman style, politics.
Right.
And that's the past. I mean, that's a Democratic Party that was a very different party, and the Clinton wing of the Democratic Party basically is responsible for having put that old Democratic Party in the grave. Remember the Democratic Leadership Council? I mean, that's what they did. That is their historical achievement, was to change the nature of the Democratic Party. And they look at Bernie Sanders, and he is a threat to everything they believe about how politics should be done and how the Democratic Party should look. And he threatens not just their philosophy, but he threatens their great historic achievement, which was to take the Democratic Party away from those sort of labor roots and make it what it is today. This party of the highly educated, affluent, white-collar, suburban, whatever. And he threatens to reverse all that. And so they look at him, and it's unthinkable.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And I think that maybe there's a psychological dimension to it too. I mean, can you imagine rebelling against your elders, which was a big, there was a big generational component to the way both Bill Clinton and Barack Obama would talk about the Joshua generation that didn't have the attach. You remember that? Didn't have the attachments to the old democratic ideals, and Clinton talked about it the same way. New vision, bridge to the
New Democrats.
New Democrats, bridge to the 21st century. And can you imagine finding out in advanced middle age that your grandparents were right all along? Can you?
I know, I know. I love it though. I love it. That's I love historical irony, Richard. And you're talking about the biggest one of them all. That the whole Clinton turn, which was supposed to be so modern and so the Silicon Valley and the internet age, and so advanced. And so beyond partisanship and beyond left and right. You remember all that crap from the '90s?
Sure. Yeah.
It's all wrong. It all is a gigantic historical blunder. Putting these guys from Wall Street in charge. Oh, what a brilliant move that was. No, it's all turned out. Stop enforcing antitrust, get NAFTA done, free trade, globalization. It was all go hang around in Davos. It was all supposed to be so modern, so unquestionable. And now look, and now it's all smashed to pieces on the floor. And Bernie Sanders did it.
And now, after generations of innovation, after playing the saxophone on Arsenio Hall, after achieving all of it, rising from the grave like some spectral visitation from an ancient Thanksgiving dinner,
I
comes
know.
Bernie Sanders saying,
Roosevelt has come back to haunt them.
yes, and unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there, but where better to leave it? Thomas Frank, as always, thanks for a great and stimulating conversation. Thomas Frank is, of course, an author and columnist for The Guardian. Tom, as always, thanks for coming on the program.
You got it, Richard. Anytime.